The Labrador arrived before sunrise. Nobody saw where he came from. Nobody knew who had dropped him off. All anyone knew was that every morning, as the first light spread across the mountains outside Sealy Lake, Montana, a yellow Labrador would appear at the ruins of the old Black Pine Ranger Station. He would sit in the ashes and wait. The wildfire had destroyed the station nearly 3 weeks earlier. The fire had been one of the worst in western Montana that season, driven by drought, high winds, and record heat. The blaze had ripped through thousands of acres of timber. Before crews finally contained it, most people wanted to forget it. The smell of smoke still lingered in the valley. Entire hillsides looked blackened and dead, and the burned remains of the ranger station stood as a painful reminder of everything that had been lost. But the Labrador never forgot. Every morning he returned, every evening he left, and every day he sat in exactly the same spot. At first, people assumed he belonged to one of the firefighters. Then they assumed he was grieving a lost owner. But when volunteers attempted to take him home, he always escaped. When animal control transported him to a shelter in Missoula, he somehow returned less than 48 hours later. More than 30 miles. Back to the ashes. Back to the same place. Back to the same patch of scorched earth. That was when people stopped seeing a grieving dog and started seeing a mystery, because the Labrador wasn't simply visiting, he was guarding something. The dog became a local legend. Truck drivers passing through stopped to look. Tourists took photographs. Residents brought him food and water, yet he seemed uninterested in everyone. His attention remained fixed on the destroyed station, especially one section near what had once been the communications room. If someone approached that area, the dog immediately stood. Not aggressively, not fearfully, just intensely, as if he desperately wanted people to notice something. His name, people eventually learned, was Scout. The identification came from a weathered tag attached to an old leather collar, but the tag contained only a name. No phone number, no address. Nothing else. The mystery deepened when retired forest ranger Caleb Mercer arrived at the site. Caleb had spent 32 years working Montana wilderness. He knew fires, he knew ranger stations, and he knew dogs. The moment he saw Scout, something bothered him. The Labrador wasn't behaving like an abandoned pet. He was behaving like a trained working dog. Scout watched people the way search and rescue animals watched people. Focused, calculating, patient. Caleb spent an entire afternoon observing him, and just before sunset, he witnessed something that changed everything. Scout stood up, walked 20 yards into the ruins, stopped, looked back toward Caleb, then returned. 10 minutes later, he repeated the behavior, again and again, almost as if he was trying to lead someone somewhere. That night, Caleb couldn't stop thinking about it. The next morning, he returned carrying maps and old incident reports. The wildfire investigation had already concluded. Officially, lightning had started the blaze. Nothing unusual, nothing suspicious. Case closed, but Caleb wasn't convinced, because there was one detail buried inside the report. One name, Ethan Brooks, the station's senior wildfire ranger, officially listed as missing during the evacuation. Most people assumed Ethan had perished in the fire. No remains had ever been recovered. The fire had burned so intensely that investigators believed little could have survived. Yet something about that conclusion felt incomplete, especially after Caleb discovered an old photograph. In the photograph stood Ethan Brooks. Beside him sat a yellow Labrador, Scout. Suddenly, the mystery changed. The dog wasn't a stray. Scout belonged to Ethan, and if Scout kept returning to the station, perhaps he wasn't mourning the past. Perhaps he was trying to tell people something about what happened there. The discovery spread through town quickly. Residents began sharing stories. Ethan had been respected, reliable, quiet. The kind of man who remembered everyone's name. He'd spent years protecting Montana forests. He knew every trail, every creek, every mountain ridge for miles. Most importantly, he never went anywhere without Scout. The two were inseparable. When Ethan inspected remote areas, Scout rode beside him. When Ethan camped overnight, Scout slept outside the tent. When Ethan trained new rangers, Scout was usually nearby. They were a team, which made one question impossible to ignore. If Ethan had died in the fire, how had Scout survived? And why had nobody found him until weeks later? Caleb began digging deeper. The more he investigated, the stranger things became. Witnesses remembered seeing Ethan shortly before the wildfire exploded, but several accounts conflicted with the official timeline. One volunteer firefighter insisted Ethan had radioed an urgent message, just hours before communication with the station was lost. Another remembered hearing Ethan argue with someone over the radio. The details were vague, but enough inconsistencies existed to raise concerns. Then Scout provided another clue. One afternoon, the Labrador suddenly left the station. For the first time in weeks, Caleb followed. The dog traveled through burned forest, moving confidently despite fallen trees and unstable terrain. Nearly 2 miles later, Scout stopped beside an abandoned fire road. Then he began digging, not randomly, not playfully, deliberately. Caleb helped. Within minutes, they uncovered a melted handheld radio. The radio belonged to Ethan. Even more surprising, technicians later recovered fragments of stored transmissions. Most were damaged, but one partial message remained. A single sentence. Someone altered the evacuation coordinates, that was all, but it changed everything. Because wildfires don't alter evacuation coordinates, people do. Suddenly, investigators reopened the case. The possibility emerged that Ethan hadn't simply been trapped by fire. Something else might have happened. Federal investigators arrived. Forest Service officials reviewed records. Communication logs were re-examined. And throughout it all, Scout remained at the station, waiting, watching. As if he knew they still hadn't found the answer. Weeks passed. Then came the first major breakthrough. Auditors discovered that large sums of federal restoration funding connected to wildfire mitigation projects had disappeared over several years. Hundreds of thousands of dollars. The paper trail led toward contractors working in remote sections of national forest. Contractors who had repeatedly interacted with the ranger station. Contractors Ethan had reportedly questioned months before the fire. The investigation expanded rapidly. Financial crimes, fraud, falsified inspections, illegal logging activity hidden inside protected forest areas. The deeper investigators looked, the uglier the picture became. And Ethan appeared to have been getting dangerously close to exposing it. Yet none of that explained Scout's behavior. Because the Labrador still refused to leave the station. Every day, same location, same routine, same silent determination. Then came another twist. A young investigator named Rachel Donovan reviewed satellite imagery captured hours before the wildfire reached Black Pine Ranger Station. She noticed something unusual, a vehicle parked behind the station, far from designated access roads. The image quality was poor, but the vehicle shouldn't have been there. Cross-referencing records revealed something even stranger. The vehicle belonged to a contractor later connected to the fraud investigation. Someone who claimed never to have visited the station that week. Now investigators had evidence suggesting otherwise. Pressure mounted, interviews intensified. Several individuals began cooperating. One confession led to another. Eventually, a disturbing picture emerged. Ethan had discovered evidence of illegal operations, hidden within wildfire prevention. Contracts. He had planned to report everything. People stood to lose careers, money, freedom. According to witnesses, Ethan intended to transmit documentation from Black Pine Ranger Station on the day the fire erupted. He never got the chance. But despite all this new information, the central mystery remained unsolved. Where was Ethan? And why did Scout continue guarding the same section of burned ground? The answer arrived unexpectedly during a September storm. Heavy rain pounded western Montana for 2 straight days. Runoff carved channels through ash and debris around the station ruins. When workers returned afterward, they noticed part of the communications room foundation had partially collapsed. Beneath the rubble was a concealed maintenance access space. Small, narrow, easy to overlook. Investigators searched it immediately. Inside, they found a waterproof storage case. And inside the case, they found Ethan's records, photographs, documents, financial evidence, audio recordings, everything he had been collecting. The evidence was enough to expose the entire corruption scheme, enough to trigger criminal charges, enough to explain why Ethan had become a target. But it still didn't explain the most important question. Scout had known about the location. How? The answer was heartbreaking. One recording captured Ethan speaking days before the fire. His voice was calm, tired, concerned. He explained that if anything happened to him, the evidence would remain hidden beneath the station. And then he laughed softly, saying there was one partner he trusted more than anyone: Scout. Investigators believed Ethan had hidden the case while Scout watched. The Labrador remembered, not because he understood documents, not because he understood crimes, but because he remembered where his best friend had spent his final hours, protecting something important. Scout wasn't guarding evidence. He was guarding Ethan's last mission. The discovery made national headlines, yet one mystery remained: Ethan himself. Months after the wildfire, no remains had been found. Many believed they never would be. Then winter arrived. Snow buried the mountains. The investigation continued quietly, and one freezing morning, Scout disappeared. For the first time since summer, he failed to appear at the station. Residents worried. Caleb worried. Search teams looked for him. 3 days later, a snowmobiler spotted a yellow Labrador deep in the forest nearly 15 miles away. Scout. The dog appeared healthy, determined, and once again he seemed to be trying to lead people somewhere. This time Caleb joined the search immediately. The Labrador guided them through steep terrain and dense timber, hour after hour, until they reached a narrow canyon hidden from most maps. There, beneath a rocky overhang, searchers discovered something extraordinary: an emergency survival shelter. Inside were signs someone had lived there briefly, fire remnants, equipment, personal belongings, and finally the answer everyone had been seeking. Ethan Brooks had survived the wildfire, at least initially. Evidence suggested he escaped the flames but suffered severe injuries. Unable to reach help, he sheltered in the canyon. Investigators reconstructed his final days through notes found inside. A waterproof journal. The entries revealed a man fighting desperately to survive, a man trying to protect evidence, a man refusing to surrender hope. Most heartbreaking of all were references to Scout. Repeatedly, Ethan wrote about sending the Labrador away, trying to force him towards safety, trying to give him a chance to live. Eventually, Scout obeyed, but not before spending days beside him. The journal ended abruptly. Search teams ultimately found Ethan's remains nearby, preserved beneath snow and rockfall. The discovery devastated the community, yet it also provided peace. After months of uncertainty, Ethan finally came home. A memorial service drew hundreds: firefighters, rangers, law enforcement officers, local families, people from towns scattered across Montana. Many had never met Ethan personally, but they had followed the story, and everyone knew who sat quietly near the front of the ceremony. Scout, the Labrador who refused to give up, the Labrador who never stopped searching, the Labrador who carried answers humans missed. As spring returned to Montana, changes began appearing throughout the Forest Service. Corrupt contracts were canceled. Several convictions followed. New oversight measures were implemented. The evidence Ethan protected changed more than a few careers. It changed entire systems. His sacrifice mattered. And somehow, in a way no one could fully explain, Scout ensured that happened. Caleb eventually adopted him, not because Scout needed rescuing, but because both of them had lost someone. The arrangement seemed natural. Every morning they hiked Montana trails together. Every evening Scout slept on Caleb's porch overlooking the mountains. For the first time in nearly a year, the Labrador seemed at peace. Yet Caleb noticed something interesting. Once every month, scouts still asked to visit Black Pine Ranger Station. The ruins had been cleared. A memorial marker now stood there. Nothing remained of the old building, just open ground, wildflowers, young trees beginning to reclaim burned earth. Whenever they visited, scouts sat quietly beside the marker, never anxious, never restless, just present, as if checking in on an old friend. Then he would stand, look across the forest, and head home. Years later, people still tell the story throughout western Montana. Visitors hear different versions. Some focus on the corruption investigation. Others focus on the wildfire. Many focus on Ethan Brooks. But the part people remember most is always the same. A Labrador sitting alone in the ashes, day after day, week after week, refusing to leave, refusing to forget. Because long before investigators found evidence, long before officials reopened the case, and long before anyone understood the truth, one dog already knew something important. Someone he loved had unfinished business, and until that story was told, until those answers were found, until Ethan Brooks finally came home, Scout wasn't going anywhere. The wildfire destroyed forests, it destroyed buildings, it destroyed lives. But it never destroyed loyalty. And sometimes when the smoke clears and every clue seems lost, the one thing that leads people back to the truth isn't technology, experience, or luck. Sometimes it's a Labrador who simply refuses to walk away. And in the mountains of Montana, that refusal changed everything.